Morgue workers, medical examiners, etc. What is the craziest death you've had to determine? Story 1. I have a few lol. P's, love your handle. Well, I don't want to disclose his name because that'll reveal the mortuary, I'm sure. But one was a famous person. It was bizarre because he was famous. There was one time I walked into the cooler and saw 5 of the same last name, murder-suicide of a family. Then there was one. It wouldn't be bizarre, I suppose. Just a natural part of death. But it was the worst. A deceased male I picked up from a medical examiner's office who was in the bloating stage of death, and I mean he was massive. Like 5x my body size, even his nether region was extremely massive compared to my hand. Unfortunate glimpse due to having to rewrap the body once I got it to the mortuary. I hope you're still reading because now that I think about it, the most bizarre thing I encountered was a severely decayed female at the medical examiner's office. I was privy to going to that one specifically to sometimes help out with an autopsy. And I was given permission to sink my hand into her skull to touch liquefied brain. She was paranoid schizophrenic, I believe, or at least delusional. She committed suicide after hearing voices and becoming convinced she was followed. Very sad. But also very interesting to see liquefied brain. It smelled absolutely horrendous. Story 2. Well, don't let it deter you, but you'd be surprised how much someone learns when they love their job, assuming you yourself are not a practiced mortician. I was only in for just over a year. Life issues happened, and for that reason I had to leave. I miss it, weirdly enough. I want to demystify a lot of the stigmas about the field, and I very passionately performed my job well, and with strong conviction. I've seen so much, a lot has stuck with me, so it's hard to choose one. But perhaps the worst, most heartbreaking thing was a 12-year-old who shot herself. She reminded me of myself when I was her age. She was particularly hard to handle because of the amount of blood that ended up on me, the seemingly sad aura about her, and just broken expression. It didn't seem like peace to me, it just felt sad. Story 3. I've seen a few in my life, though not being part of the ME or coroner. In the past I worked as a deputy, so every so often we'd have to do calls where inevitably we ran across deceased persons. A couple that stick in my mind as being the most bizarre responded to a house after a man's wife called to report her husband had been attacked. We arrived to find the man dead. The best we could ever figure out was he was involved in an accident with horses. We had another case that took the better part of 2 years to solve. In that case, a young boy, about 15, was found at the scene, severely injured. His friends weren't talking about what happened, and while yes, foul play was suspected, we couldn't exactly arrest on suspicions. Story 4. 4 hours later, Sean Doyle's body was finally recovered. Its temperature was 125 degrees. The medical examiners thought it was likely way higher, but thermometers don't read any higher than that. When Melanex saw the body on her autopsy table, she writes, she thought he had been subjected to extreme heat. His entire outer layer of skin had peeled off, and his internal organs were literally cooked. He otherwise had no broken bones and no head trauma, which meant he was alive during the extreme heat exposure. Story 5. Did an internship at the office of the chief medical examiner. Guy committed suicide in a river by wearing a backpack of rocks. Was found soon and didn't have much bloating, etc. due to the submersion. Upon examination, he had a lung infection where his right lung had disintegrated into green liquid. We removed 1.5 liters of green fluid from his chest cavity. His left lung was fine. It was determined after looking at his medical records that he had been to the doctor's office 5 times before he committed suicide, and that this infection had been going on for almost a year until it got this bad. Numerous doctors had overlooked it. Accounts from those who knew him suspected that he killed himself to stop the pain. Story 6. I can talk about this one actually. I was a morgue intern in college. There weren't really many weird causes of death. 80% of it is just heart disease in its various forms, then just failure of other organs. Then you have the occasional physical accident, the very, very rare homicide. The weird things were usually the situations that came up. My personal favorite example would have to be this one. Imagine, if you will, a 400-pound woman driving alone on the highway. For reasons unknown, she drives off of the road into a ditch. The car flips upside down, she's hanging by her seatbelt. The EMTs arrive, she's barely conscious, they cut her seatbelt. She comes down, she goes out, she never comes back up. So anyway, the logistics of managing 400 pounds of dead weight are challenging, to say the least. It takes 4 of us to get anything done. The doctor is doing the usual external examination and needs to see the backside. Two people get on one side to pull, and someone else and I get on the other side to push. And as I push against the rolls of fat, I slowly lift it up like a treasure chest in The Legend of Zelda, and what do I find? 4 dimes, hidden in the rolls of her back fat. I think the weird thing about this is that she was wearing a shirt when she died, which means those dimes were already there. Like, did she keep them there on purpose? Would she be driving with someone and say, "Hey Jim, can you get the change for the toll?" Second shelf, far right. And I have to imagine that they had to return the money to her relatives along with everything else. Here's her clothes, here's her purse, here's 40 cents, don't ask. Story 7. I was on the verge of working the county morgue last summer. The morgue is right beside the county prison too, so the morgue processes deceased inmates for the county because it's cheaper that way. When I went in for my formal interview, they took me on a little tour and run through of what they do and procedure, and they let me sit in while they did an autopsy. The guy on the table was an inmate in maximum security who had died in his cell and no one was sure how. So they start to work their way through the process of the autopsy, and they notice lots of blood near his intestines. As they start to inspect that, an intern saw something inside the guy, so the medical examiner removed it and blood poured out and his intestines emptied. This person had inserted a short but thick metal object inside him, which in the process sliced open the internal parts of his rectum, and he died from internal bleeding. The object was big enough to seal off the exit, basically, and all the blood and other material was stuck inside of him until they removed it. Edit. Grammar. Edit PT2. Great. Now my most popular comment is about internal rectal bleeding. Story 8. I was a volunteer at a hospital who worked in storage. It was right next to the morgue, but I was also one of the restockers for it too. Weirdest 3 things I've seen where 1. Guy being brought in buckets. His legs were crushed by a box flattener. The upper half of him died in the ER. 2. The day with overflow. About 20 people died in less than a day at the small hospital. It has 9 drawers. They had people in the non-refrigerated part with ice bags on them. Then they had 3 guys in the employee-only hallway. They were trying to get a funeral place to come hold them for them. 3. A guy tried to steal the body of some girl. He was her ex and decided it was his divine right to bury her in his yard instead of her husband of a year. He kicked in the door when the hall was clear, put her in a wheelchair, then tried to sneak her out of the store loading dock. He was stopped only because patients are not allowed to exit through these doors, sir, and had to leave through the front lobby where he was recognized by a family friend. 4. Extra, but I wasn't there for it. 450 pounds plus 5 feet woman died who was too fat for their fridge, so they needed the local zoo to take her. She also had her CAT scan done at a different zoo. Story 9. I'm the admin assistant at a small funeral home in a smallish city. Not much really goes on. The other day I swore I heard someone cough in the back office while I was supposed to be alone in the building. The creepiest stuff to me is when we get gruesome deaths. I never thought I'd have to see bodies in the state that I've seen some bodies. Sorry, peeps. I hate the ones like suicides, car wrecks, and overdoses. I live in a place with high poverty, so we get a decent amount of overdoses. Once we got someone who died in a car wreck, but the car caught on fire, and they weren't found until way after, just a burned-up torso. Once we got one so far decomposed that the ME didn't even bother stitching them up after the autopsy. I can still smell that one. And sometimes the body looks fine and all, but they purge like hell. I'm getting nauseous thinking about the colors, smells, and noises from purges. Story 10. I'm a pathologist, and I've done quite a lot of autopsies. Non-forensic ones, like sudden deaths, substance overdoses, suicides, and road accidents. I think most people would be surprised to learn that the actual autopsy involves careful examination rather than just cutting open the body. This process, called evisceration, involves removing organs in blocks, and it's very physical work. Technicians often assist or perform parts of it, sometimes more efficiently. Obese bodies are particularly challenging, especially if the person has been deceased for some time. Fat can obscure organs and make dissection more difficult. Vascular issues are common in overweight individuals, and the heart and lungs often show signs of stress or disease. Pathologies such as blocked arteries, lung problems, and other chronic conditions are frequently observed. Suicides and accidents are also common cases we handle. After the examination, organs are carefully placed back, and bodies are prepared respectfully for viewing by the family. Funeral directors handle the final preparation with great care, ensuring the appearance is suitable. Everyone involved treats the bodies with respect, and attention is given to hygiene and proper handling. Over time, one becomes accustomed to the environment and smells. I have nothing but praise for funeral directors. Their work requires compassion and professionalism, and they often do not receive enough recognition. Story 11. I've got 3 stories for you. I used to work in the Office of Medical Examiners in a Southwest state. Story 1. A man was found dead in his home, completely naked, with water all over the floor and no signs of trauma. There were some unusual items in his home, and he had engaged in risky behavior that led to an internal injury and ultimately his death. Story 2. A man accidentally ran himself over with his own car while performing an extreme stunt involving chains. He tripped and couldn't get out of the way in time, which led to his death. Story 3. A wife was initially accused of murder when her husband's body was found in their backyard with a gunshot wound to the head at an unusual angle, gun still in hand. It was later determined that he had accidentally shot himself during a moment of stress. When asked why she didn't call the police immediately, she said she didn't want to deal with the ridiculous situation. Story 12. I may be late to the party, but I finally have a good story to tell. In medical school, my group's cadaver was an 80-plus-year-old female who was extremely unfit, morbidly obese with muscles half the size of any other cadavers. Her pectoral muscles were very thin. To get some reference, we figured she was bedridden during her last few months, which would somewhat explain these findings. When we started our neurology unit and began to dissect the infratemporal fossa, I discovered a small metal pellet under the skin behind her right ear. My tankmates and I went on to find dozens of these metal pellets around her head's anatomy, with some lodged into the cranium and others in the bones of her face. We contacted her living relatives for clarification, and they revealed that when she and her brother were children, she was 8 years old, they were playing with an old decorative rifle mounted above the fireplace. Long story short, the brother accidentally discharged the rifle into her face. The aftermath was that she was blind and wheelchair-bound for the rest of her life, and the pellets weren't all removed. It was an interesting dissection with that context, but a sobering reminder that cadavers are humans with their own struggles and rich lives. If you're considering donating your body to science, please know that we don't take the responsibility lightly. Her granddaughter made a point of saying this lady did not hold a grudge against her brother, and they lived full lives on happy terms. Story 13. Agreed, and it was incredibly sad to see the effects of it 80-some-odd years later. It was really big of her to not let it sour her life and still maintain good relations with her brother, though. We had one cadaver that passed away from natural causes in his late 60s. Given what we found, I'm inclined to believe he never saw a doctor in his life. When we begin our dissections, we start with the muscles of the back, arms, and legs. Then we move on to the nervous system, and eventually the abdominal, thoracic, and pelvic cavities in that order. Everything was textbook up until we exposed her abdomen initially. The anatomy was present, but something just seemed off. After cleaning up some of the fascia and visceral fat, we had exposed the liver, GI tract, stomach, and spleen. Yet something just seemed off, but we couldn't place our fingers on it. It's amazing how something so apparent that's right in front of your eyes didn't click until someone said, "Hey guys, why is his liver on his left?" This man's entire anatomy was mirrored. We found his heart and spleen to be on the right as opposed to the left, and everything on the opposite side of where it was supposed to be. This cadaver had situs inversus totalis, a condition where the internal organs develop on the opposite side of where they're supposed to. It's incredibly rare, with estimated frequency of cases where just the thoracic cavity, heart and lungs is mirrored, are around 0.001%. This gentleman had all his internal organs mirrored. It almost certainly contributed to his death, unfortunately. The reason I mentioned him probably not having seen a doctor is because if you try to listen to the heart of someone with this condition, you won't hear it because it's not in the regular spot. The body was eventually taken from us students in order to be dissected professionally and presented to more future students down the line. When parents tell their child they're 1 in a million, it's not usually true, but it very much may have been true in this gentleman's case. Edit. Some errors. Story 14. I worked as an anatomical pathology technician. Basically, my job is to carry out the external examination of a patient and then eviscerate them, ready for the pathologists to dissect the organs and determine a cause of death. When I was a trainee, it was a sort of rite of passage for you to eviscerate the decomposed bodies. I always used to make my first incision and then leave the body to gas off, which literally made your eyes burn. It smelt that bad. But ultimately, when it came to eviscerating the body itself, it seemed to make it not smell as bad once the gases had all been expelled. Maggoty bodies are generally the worst, because the maggots literally get everywhere. Dozens of times I could feel them crawling up my sleeves and inside my scrubs. As you can imagine, you see some really disturbing stuff in the profession, but one that will always stick with me is a 13-year-old girl I had to autopsy, who had jumped from a bridge due to online bullying and had been in the water for about 3 weeks. I remember her coming in, being partly skeletal, sopping wet, and covered in mud. I couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sadness as I looked at her because of how young she was and that she had taken her own life due to bullying. I will never forget looking at her few strands of long brown hair that were left on the remaining parts of her scalp. Anyways, before we can carry out the autopsy, she needed to be undressed. Her jeans were full of sand and mud, so I had to carefully cut these off of her and hose her down as I went along. As I was pulling off her jeans, some of her muscle on the lower part of her leg was still clung to the bone, and as I pulled the jeans over it, it made her toes and foot starting twitching and moving. I had to stop what I was doing and take 5 minutes outside. Not because it scared me, but it all just seemed to hit me in that moment. Story 15. Just sharing some professional observations from my work. I had the opportunity to examine a very thin patient who had suffered from a long-term condition that caused extreme malnutrition. Their body showed severe changes in organ size and muscle mass due to prolonged illness. During the examination, it was evident that many organs were unusually small, and the skeletal structure was prominent. The liver was notably reduced in size, the brain was soft, and the lungs were positioned lower than typical. Stomach contents were present throughout parts of the digestive tract. Despite the severe changes, the cause of death was determined to be liver failure, with complications from aspiration pneumonia. One noticeable detail was the visibility of the spinal column and certain bones due to the extreme thinness. The anatomy overall reflected long-term malnutrition and its effects on the body. Story 16. I worked as a forensic technician/medical examiner's assistant for about 2 years. We were trained in both autopsies and decedent removal from death scenes. Some situations were unusual or disturbing, but I'll summarize the main cases. Hoarding and unsanitary living conditions. 2 brothers lived in a severely damaged house with no running water. The deceased was found in his bedroom, and the home was extremely cluttered and unsanitary. Despite the shocking conditions, the autopsy was unremarkable. Animal interaction after death. A man cycling through a field died suddenly, and by the time of discovery, parts of his face had been damaged by wildlife. Precautions were taken to safely handle the body. Accident with a high-tension wire. A man died in an accident involving a wire, resulting in severe injury. This was the only case of decapitation I witnessed. Pregnancy-related death. A woman passed away during late pregnancy. The autopsy allowed examination of the amniotic sac without damage, providing professional insight while being extremely sad. Medication-related death. A dental student died due to the effects of an experimental drug. Emergency teams, hazmat, and police were involved to safely recover the body. These experiences were unusual and sometimes distressing, but they provided important insight into forensic procedures and the challenges of the profession. Story 17. I interned at a funeral home/crematorium in high school. I was goth. It was the perfect street cred internship. The funeral home owner was a nice guy, Phil, with a PH, and he always introduced himself that way. He had a family and was married, great sense of humor, bright personality, almost bubbly. About 8 to 9 months after my internship ended, Phil was forced to stop working. He had began, according to him, to find worms inside people. Long, white, wriggling worms, thousands of them filling people's bodies. He had called the CDC, local doctors, hospitals, other funeral homes on the West Coast. No one else had found the worms, but he began to find them inside every person he worked on. He talked non-stop about the worms, first to his family, then to the families of clients, then to strangers. He had a total breakdown after autopsying a young boy somewhere between 6 to 8 years old who was almost entirely worms, again according to PH. After the breakdown, Phil was pushed out of his business and it was sold to a national chain. About 6 months after being forced out, Phil killed himself. While I never got to read the note itself, his wife later told me that he had written about being able to feel the worms inside himself and not being able to stand it. He had begged his wife in the note to follow him and to also kill their children, as when he looked at his sons, all he could see were the worms inside them. Story 18. My neighbor a while back before I moved was a mortician. He had a body he was preparing for a very early morning wake. So as he's working on it, he turned his back to grab some tools or supplies, and the angle he was standing at with regard to the corpse left the body visible just out of the corner of his eye. As he was looking down at whatever tools he was getting, in the corner of his eye he saw the body slowly start to sit up. His fight/flight instinct immediately kicked in, and he ran to the stairs as fast as he possibly could, but he was so clumsy trying to get up the stairs he tripped and was pretty much crawling and clawing his way to the top. Story 19. I had just started my shift and was using a restroom in the back. When I came out, I heard what sounded like a girl sobbing, and the sound of feet shuffling around on the floor. The floor was kinda gravely, and had a distinct sound if you scooted your feet on it. The sound was coming from around a corner that led into a small room where we would store embalmed bodies ready to be delivered to their respective funeral home. I figured someone was upset and crying, so I kinda snuck in, still hearing the sobbing. When I peeked around the corner, the room was empty, no living person in there. I noticed that there was only one body in there as well, a young girl. She had passed away from her own actions. I wasn't scared per se, but I'm pretty sure you could audibly hear my heartbeat. Story 20. Former biological anthropologist. As an undergrad, I worked for a forensic anthropologist. This is the weirdest case she had that I got to see for myself. It was from the 1920s. My boss had inherited a coroner's collection of odd/interesting bones he collected during his tenure in a major city. Back then, coroners could just take whatever they wanted from bodies without telling the families. If the individual was poor/indigent/an immigrant/a minority, they really helped themselves, sometimes taking the whole body. This coroner took a lot of stuff, even rearticulating some of the pieces, reconstructing how they looked when they were attached to the rest of the person. So anyway, she has this collection she inherited, and several of the pieces are designated what she calls death by testosterone poisoning. They did not literally die of testosterone poisoning, but they all died because of risky, stupid, ridiculous actions. Think Jackass, only with no monetary payout. The weirdest one was from early last century, a white man in his 40s who died from sepsis from multiple arm fractures that he got in an arm wrestling contest. Why multiple fractures? Because even after cracking his humerus, upper arm bone a bit, he couldn't bear losing, so he just wrapped it up with some kind of splint, had some guy hold the fracture, just a crack at that point, and went for best 2 out of 3, whereupon he snapped the humerus all the way through and broke his radius and ulna when he slammed his arm down on the edge of the table in anger. The preserved bones came with the whole story recounted in the coroner's notes. One of the lower arm bones, radius or ulna, I can't remember which, protruded through the skin, and being too cheap/too stupid to see a doctor, the wound became gangrenous and the infection entered his bloodstream. He died of septicemia a few weeks later. Looking at the bone, I could see all of the fractures, as well as where the infection had attacked the periosteum and the bone itself, with no sign of healing. TLDR, stupid pointless arm wrestling contest results in multiple arm fractures, gangrene, and death from septicemia. Labeled jokingly as death by testosterone poisoning by the owner of the anatomical collection the bones are a part of. Story 21. Combining the facts and my own assumptions, I would say it was a rapidly progressing colorectal cancer of some kind, possibly related to underlying Lynch syndrome, that metastasized to the liver, the lymph nodes, the peritoneum, etc. This was a forensic, as opposed to clinical, autopsy. So some of the techniques that could have been used to construct a more precise narrative of what had occurred in regards to his cancer, which was not the cause of his death, was beyond the scope of that procedure, but durable tissue samples were taken to make pursuing that option available to the family. I really don't have an explanation for it. There are rare causes of reduced pain sensitivity, many of which wouldn't be a possible explanation in this instance, but some of which might. Toxicology was positive for strong painkillers, but in such a way that suggested a more isolated exposure, as opposed to chronic use, but there are limits on what can be known for sure there. It's possible that a sedentary lifestyle combined with adherence to the kind of low-protein, low-sodium, no-alcohol diet that a doctor might recommend to someone with, say, liver failure, combined with occasional use of strong painkillers, did somehow in conjunction mask his symptoms. It's also possible that he was doing something, I don't know what, just something, which he believed to be damaging enough to the body that he felt it explained his symptoms, and for whatever reason didn't consider the pain, the vomiting, the fatigue, the blood in his stool or whatever else undesirable or cause for concern. Maybe he had tried certain unprescribed substances and had been under the mistaken impression that exposure was somehow sufficient to explain subsequent problems, and he was too embarrassed or afraid to tell anyone. It's also possible that somehow he knew what his situation was, and there is just no record of it, and he didn't pursue treatment or tell anyone or drop out of school or do anything that would give any indication that he was in possession of that knowledge. With each explanation I can think of, there are valid criticisms of said explanation, and so nothing has ever felt like a perfect fit in this instance. Story 22. My father works in a maritime shipping company. During his time in the sea, he has witnessed many deaths, but here are the two crazier in my opinion. To get an idea of the environment, both happened in a Suezmax-type tanker. This one is the crazier, regarding the cause of death. The ship's only kitchen has a room right below it, which is basically for food storage and bodies, in case someone dies during a journey. The staircase leading to the room below is made of iron and is really steep, with a height of about 5 meters. A cook forgot an ingredient which was needed to not ruin a big batch of food he was preparing. As he rushed down the staircase, 1 meter before the landing, he slipped and fell. From the autopsy, it was found that the poor guy broke just his fibula and tibia, and probably died from shock. Another incident happened in the North Atlantic. The ship was filled with cargo and was lowered with only a few meters between the deck and the sea level. There was a heavy storm the night before, and the crew had to lock themselves inside the accommodation. The next morning, the captain, the first officer, and the chief engineer went outside to look for potential damages. The sea was calm, too calm, and they didn't bring any radios together. As they were checking the bow, a huge wave appeared in the distance. The people on patrol at the bridge had no way to alert the other three and started honking the horn to no avail. The wave hit. One died instantly, hitting a pipe and getting decapitated, his head never to be found. The second one's body was never found. The third guy got stuck between a clutter of pipes, breaking every bone in his body and turning into an amorphous mass. Story 23. I'm a detective who has attended a number of autopsies. Some cases were unusual and medically interesting. One involved a patient who had previously undergone a surgical procedure on the skull. Complications later occurred due to an accidental fall. Another case involved a worker who suffered a serious accident on a construction site. Emergency personnel had to intervene to safely handle the situation. There was also a case of a young woman whose health deteriorated under complex personal circumstances. Investigators examined the situation carefully, and the case highlighted the challenges of determining cause of death when multiple factors are involved. Each of these experiences emphasized the importance of careful investigation, attention to detail, and understanding the medical and social factors in forensic work. Story 24. I am a security officer at a local hospital with a major psych ward. I had to put a body of a psych patient in the morgue after he died by suicide. He did this all within 5 feet of the RN station and without making a sound. Story 25. This isn't mine, but I took a criminal justice course back in college, and the professor was a sheriff or something in Kansas back in his earlier days. In any case, this still sticks with me today, over 15 years later. He responded to a call someone had made about a really bad smell. As it goes with these things, he got there and it was the worst smell he ever smelled. It had been a particularly humid summer, and this was obviously something that had died. He goes in, inevitably sees the body in the bedroom, extremely obese woman, empty bottles of Jack Daniels and food wrappers all around her, and bugs just covering the body, all on top of the worst smell ever. Seemed pretty clear what the cause of death was, probably a combination of drink and poor health with a lack of ability to move. As he gets closer, he realizes that she is moving. Not just moving but breathing. They eventually get her out and into the ER. I want to say some specialized equipment was needed because of her obesity, and there are bugs living in her mouth and throat. She died from complications from the whole ordeal, but the idea of being eaten alive by bugs and them essentially colonizing your body while you are still alive sounded pretty terrible. Story 26. Autopsy technician. I had a young man who died by suicide in a tragic and violent manner. Serious mental illness was involved. I ran a funeral home for a few years, and I've been assisting on autopsies for many years, so I could probably think of plenty of cases. Edit. I changed kid to guy since he was really young, but people keep asking me if this was like a 10-year-old. He was 24. Story 27. Assisted with a post-mortem when I was a student. Female patient died in her 40s. Her medical history included extensive complaints of abdominal pains. One doctor even referred to her as a hypochondriac, and others commented on apparent anxiety. Upon opening her abdomen, she had extensive scar tissue and was severely affected internally by endometriosis. She suffered for decades and was never referred for a laparoscopy. She didn't actually have anxiety. She had a medical condition. Edit. A few clarifications. The patient's cause of death was unrelated. I won't give any details to avoid identification. I am UK-based, and this was an NHS post-mortem. The patient did not have diagnosed anxiety. Doctors referred to her anxiety only in relation to her abdominal pain complaints, with no other known history. Thank you for sharing your stories with me and others. I will take the time to read every one. Story 28. Not mine, but a doctor I used to work with. Back when he was in school, he would do his cadaver labs really late at night, to many people during the day. One time it was really late. Around 2 a.m., he was listening to his lecture on his headphones, and he saw the cadaver's arm move/twitch. He thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him. Then, he saw it again, proceeded to run away in a panic. He told a few of his classmates what happened, but nobody believed him. Next day they had a group cadaver lab with the same cadaver. The arm twitched yet again. The professor did some digging, and it turns out the patient's pacemaker was still fully functional and occasionally fired, causing the arm twitch. He was so relieved. He thought there was a zombie in there. Story 29. I may be late to the party, but I finally have a good story to tell. In medical school, my group's cadaver was an 80-plus-year-old female who was extremely unfit, morbidly obese with muscles half the size of any other cadavers. Her pectoral muscles were paper-thin, to get some reference. We figured she was bedridden during her last few months, which would somewhat explain these findings. When we started our neurology unit and began to dissect the infratemporal fossa, I discovered a small metal pellet under the skin behind her right ear. My tankmates and I went on to find dozens of these metal pellets strewn around her head's anatomy, with some lodged into the cranium and others in the bones of her face. We contacted her living relatives to get some clarification, and they ended up revealing that when this lady and her brother were children, they said she was 8 years old. They were playing with an old decorative rifle that the family had mounted above the fireplace. Long story short, the brother accidentally discharged the rifle into the girl's face. The aftermath was this lady was blind and wheelchair-bound for the rest of her life, and the pellets weren't all removed. It was an interested dissection with that information from then on, but a sobering moment in reminding our class that our cadavers are humans with their own struggles and rich lives. If you're considering donating your body to science, please know that we don't take the responsibility lightly, and a million thanks aren't enough. I have more stories if anyone is curious. Edit. I should add that her granddaughter made a point of saying this lady did not hold a grudge on her brother, and they lived full lives on happy terms. Story 30. Performing an autopsy on an elderly patient with cardiac valve disease and found a 3 centimeters white plastic disc lodged in the ostium of one of the renal arteries. It was identical to the disc of the patient's tilting valve-type mechanical aortic valve, which was in place, intact, and functioning normally. We had no explanation for why an extra valve disc was present far downstream from the heart. An in-depth review of the patient's surgical history revealed that many years prior, during the installation of the patient's aortic valve, the cage for the valve broke while being installed, and the disc had flown into the aorta and couldn't be retrieved. The surgeon immediately removed the broken cage, replaced the entire apparatus with another replacement valve, and completed the surgery. We found no evidence that there was any subsequent investigation to determine the whereabouts of the lost valve component. So for years, apparently unknown to most of his caretakers and even potentially to the patient had a cardiac valve disc lodged in his renal artery ostium, in such a way that it was non-obstructing and stable, and it was discovered as an incidental finding at the patient's autopsy. Story 31. In a previous career, I was a U.S. Army CID agent, and every death investigation that required an autopsy, we had to send an agent to photograph and observe for the case file. One guy who had been stabbed through the heart with a steak knife by his wife was in peak physical shape, but when the pathologist pulled his brain out, he said, "Look at this. I have no biology training, but the golf ball-sized tumor on his brainstem was obvious even to me." Doctor said he had maybe 90 days to live at the time of his death. The wife went to prison for murder, and all she had to do was wait a few months, and she'd have been a hero army widow.